moral relativity. The discoveries in cosmology and the discoveries in biology impacted studies of human behavior. Morality is the field that studies not only what humans do, but what humans should do. Moral philosophy is about what a person should do when they interact with other people. It should come as no surprise that when Darwin finished his study on the origin of species, right? He's dealing with everybody, that Darwin then turned his attention specifically to man, right? What was the origin of man? And so he wrote a book in 1871 called The Descent of Man. And in that, he treated the evolution of man as any other species. And there are things that Darwin said in The Descent of Man that are wrong, right? Because his observations and his understanding don't match what can be accomplished in the 20th century. That said, his basic premise stood. So what was that basic premise? Well, he started out with the question, what is man? And he knew about the Greeks, and the Greeks argued that man was a body and a soul. It's kind of hard to imagine this because we have this idea of body and soul, but for the soul animates the body, but the soul is separate from the body. So one of the best ways to sort of imagine this is to think of Peter Pan. If you've ever seen Peter Pan is flying around the world and he's got Never Never Land, and Peter Pan also has his shadow, right? And eventually he loses his shadow. That shadow is more like what the Greeks imagined a soul to be. It was something that was non-corporal, right? It didn't have a body, but could be visible more in the way what we would see a ghost. So Darwin's aware of this concept of souls animating bodies, that when the soul leaves the body decays and becomes inanimate. In the Christian tradition, Genesis sets forth the idea that man is made in the image of God, right? Genesis 1. In our image, we created man, male and female. They're in the image of God. So that in this tradition, human beings are separate from, distinct from, and above every other animal. Right? In the second Genesis story, man is placed as having dominion over an animal kingdom, right? This whole idea of an animal kingdom, that man is the king of the planet. Darwin then looks at this and he's looking at the human body, he's looking at the human mind, and he sees nothing special. Right? If you dissect a human, which Europeans started doing first illegally in the 15th and 16th century, it was illegal to dissect bodies, but They did it. People like Leonardo da Vinci did it anyway. They wanted to study the human body. They wanted to study the muscles. By the 19th century, it becomes pretty commonplace. And so when Cuvier introduces comparative anatomy in fossils, other scientists go, you know, we can start doing comparative anatomy with human bodies. So they start knowing what's inside of a human, the human skeleton. They know what's inside the mind. They know what's inside the eye, right? Because they're dissecting all that. And they start doing comparative studies between human bones and animal bones. And when, you know, Darwin looks at all these studies and looks at all the evidence, there's nothing distinct about a body, and there's nothing distinct about a mind. There's a bunch of mush up there. They even do some studies about trying to measure the weight of a soul. So, right, they would take a body, a person that was dying, and then wait until the person dead, and they would do a measurement. Was there a measurable difference between when the soul left the body and the person died and before? And there's really no difference. So Darwin then looked at human beings from the perspective of natural selection. And he looked at human behaviors, how humans treat each other from the point of view of natural selection. And so moral philosophers had described these things, such as love, shame, curiosity. Right? These are all what we would consider higher level human behaviors, non-instinctual human behaviors. And Darwin asked, do these have to be put into a human being by some god or goddess? Because for thousands of years, that's how humans explained the presence of love, right? Cupid comes, shoots his bow, and all of a sudden you're struck by a desire for that beautiful person that they saw. We still have this Valentine's Day where we're coming up on that celebration of love. This idea of shame, that a god has to tell you, don't do that. And if you do it, you're breaking the rules of God. Or curiosity. Well, what Darwin said is this intellectual capacity gives an advantage to a comparatively weak individual. Right? There are lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, they are much bigger. They are much stronger. Just saw a little video about this woman who felt a presence behind her and turns around, and there's a cougar staring straight at her. And there's all kinds of stories of people going walk in the woods and cougars pounce on them from behind and eat them, because from their perspective, you're just food. So this woman, right, may not be able to fight off a cougar, but she turned around and put on Metallica, and she played it on her cell phone, and Metallica scared the cougar away. I mean, the Metallica would scare me away. So it did work with the cougar, right? So here we have an example of a weak, physically weak species using an intellectual advantage to do it, which means this woman lived longer than she would have. And by living longer, she can then pass this intellectual advantage on to her kids. Darwin says this is how all of these qualities evolved. There is a social advantage to cultivating love. As weak individuals, if we show aspects that we call love, right? Kindness, generosity, respect for others, all those things that go into love, we're going to have people with us. But if we're an asshole, we're going to drive people away. And as a weak individual, we are better off with people we love around us, because when we have people we love around us, it's going to help us have more food, have more shelter. We're going to live longer. And when we live longer, we have more babies and pass it on. Ideas like shame. You can even see shame in a dog, right? If a dog does something that is not, quote, right, if it misbehaves, dogs can have shame. They feel bad, or at least we project they feel bad. They have behaviors that look like shame. Cats are curious, right? Curiosity kills the cat. So these intellectual qualities that humans had attributed as special to themselves can be found in other species, and there are evolutionary benefits to them for the species survival. Because there is this social advantage to a comparatively weak individual. Human beings get more food, have better life, have better health when they treat others decently. That helps a physically weak, right? We're compared to a chimpanzee, a human's physically weak. Compared to a bear, physically weak. So this is not about survival of the strongest. It's survival of the fittest, the best able to adapt. And so for Darwin, all of the qualities that humans attribute to themselves, all of the divine qualities that humans attributed to themselves, were selected naturally for the species, the human species, to survive. There's an altruistic advantage to a comparatively weak individual. Altruism is giving to others, sharing with others. Individuals that share have more people around them. When you have more people around you, it helps stabilize your life. When you have a stable life, you have more food, you have more clothing, you have more shelter, and you're going to have more babies. Once again, Darwin got pieces of this puzzle wrong, right? He made some things that he observed weren't actually, don't hold water. But this overall assessment of why humans, what is the advantage of being a human over being a chimp? What is the advantage of being a human over being a bear, right? What does this species, this human species, have that allows it to get food and reproduce? And the answer to that is There's an intellectual advantage, there's a social advantage, there's an altruistic advantage. What is Darwin ignoring, right? What doesn't Darwin ask in this question of the origin of man or the descent of man? What isn't he bringing into his argument? What isn't necessary for his argument? He's not mentioning a god, a goddess, or any mythological stories, right? He's placing forth an argument based on observation and reason, right? He's observing human behaviors and he is explaining reasonably why there are a competitive advantage. He's not making any claims either for or against God. He's just ignoring God. God was unnecessary for this argument. Other scholars were working outside of the world of biology and dealing with this question of morality. One such person was Friedrich Nietzsche. Right? Friedrich Nietzsche was a German working about the same time as Darwin. He's a little bit younger than Darwin. And in 1872, wrote a groundbreaking work called The Birth of Tragedy. And he was looking simply at what basically we said the history of moral thought. And he described one approach to morality as Apollonian, after the Greek god Apollo. The Greek god Apollo was the god of order, the god of mathematics, the god of music. And even the word we have in music have a composition where you're going to take various sounds and place them next to each other so they sound good, right? It's not just chaos. It's got rhythm. It's got melody. It's got pitch. All of those things are orderly, unlike Metallica, which is just yuck. Huh? So Nietzsche argued that if you look through human history, you will find people that prefer an Apollonian approach where they impose order on all human behavior. On the other hand, if you look at human behavior, you can also see then people that favor a Dionysiac approach. This was named after the Greek god of revelry, of wine, of celebration, of letting go. In other words, while Apollo was there for order, Dionysus was there for chaos. And there are some people that prefer chaos. And these two approaches to human behavior for Nietzsche are in constant conflict with each other. And it causes a tension. He expands on this idea in his seminal work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or Thus Spoke Zoroaster. Right? In which he proclaimed, he by Zarathustra proclaimed, God is dead. Now, this one phrase has become wildly misunderstood or wildly feared, because in the story, right, Nietzsche is creating this story of a man, Zarathustra, a prophet, Zarathustra, who looks around the world and he said, God is dead. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, he meant that people had stopped living an impulsive life. They weren't living to the will to power. People had become slaves to morality and science. That by studying God, instead of feeling God or feeling life, the study of things had killed it. The Apollonian approach to experience had killed experience. And what Nietzsche preferred was a return to a Dionysian approach where people just experienced it. That could only take place in a context of the will to power. Every human being needed to follow their own personal desires. Nietzsche was incredibly critical of Christianity. He called Christianity a slave religion because Christianity tells people to love their neighbor as themselves. Nietzsche said, no, you need to love yourself as yourself. You don't bow to the wishes of others. It is self-empowerment, self-desire, self-fulfillment. Somebody's going to hold you down and put you in a box and tell you your desires are bad, whether it's your sexual desires, your food desires, your power desires. No, pursue power because it's people in power that are making up these stories about order and control and denial. So what did Nietzsche want? Nietzsche wanted an Übermensch, a superhuman, right? Uber is above, Mensch is human. A human that could follow his own desires, a human that could exercise his will to power so that they wouldn't be kept down, they wouldn't be put aside, that they could fulfill in power their own destiny. In other words, each individual has their own morality. When you ask yourself, what should you do? It's not what should I do in terms of God, not what should I do in terms of grandma or grandpa or what this person or that say. Look in yourself and decide what's good for you. Do what's good for you. So there is no, in Nietzschean terms, there is no universal morality. All morality is relative to the individual and the individual desires. Hopefully you can understand and see how this Nietzschean approach to morality is widespread in modern society. It also is at the root of, later on, what becomes the Nazi movement, because it's all about power. Exercising power is what makes people human. It is right to exercise power. It is wrong to be weak.